I'm sure most pilots can relate to the fact that though flying is one of the most fun and rewarding things a person can do, there are some flights that are simply pleasant, like taking your significant other up for a beautiful evening flight, and some that are super stressful, like your check ride, or taking your significant other up for a beautiful evening flight. However, one flight for me had nothing to do with a check ride nor significant other, but it was easily the most stressful flight I have ever had. And yet somehow, it was also the best and most enjoyable flight I've ever had. Back in 2022, I was tasked with ferrying a PA-11 from Cut Bank, Montana to Cordova, Alaska. This was to be my third run to and from Alaska that summer, and little did I know that the last leg of the trip would be the most mentally stressing flight I've ever experienced. But I should have been forewarned right out of the gate, as I had to partake in unusual physical stress just to get to the airplane when the bus from the commercial airport dropped me and my 80 pounds of camping gear and survival equipment about 2 miles down the road from the Cut Bank airport. When I finally did reach that old World War II hangar at Cut Bank, I thankfully found that this PA-11 was a beauty of an airplane. Not because it had shiny new paint or expensive avionics or anything like that, but because it was beautifully simple and in great shape. Before delving straight into the story of the ferry itself, I want to talk a little bit about the PA-11, just in case there are people out there who aren't familiar. Piper designed the PA-11 Cub Special by taking the standard J3 Cub and moving the fuel tank to the left wing, and fully enclosing the cowling on a larger 95 horsepower engine. They also moved the seats back a number of inches so that, unlike the J3, the PA-11 could be flown solo from the front seat. Though many modifications exist for all of the Piper Cub variants, this PA-11 kept it old school and was not equipped with an electrical system or flaps or not even a starter. But this simplicity made it an absolute joy to fly as I winged my way across the border into Canada, heading northwest along the same route I had taken in the PA-12 just a few months before. But unlike that first time in the PA-12, this time I was solo, and the Alcan route to Alaska was somewhat familiar. I made my way past Calgary, stopping at Drumheller for fuel and rest for the night. The PA-11 had more than enough room for all my camping gear and survival equipment, so I camped out that night to test everything out. Camping out behind the airplane and hand-propping it at every engine start brought me back to an old, more simple way to fly, and the PA-11 seemed to have everything it needed and nothing that it didn't. Well, except for one thing: fuel range. The one thing I'll say the PA-11 definitely lacked was fuel range. It only had one 18-gallon fuel tank in the wing, and with the engine burning just under 6 gallons an hour and an average ground speed of about 70 knots, the range was limited to about 160 nautical miles if I wanted to land with a healthy fuel reserve. For this reason, I carried 2 fuel cans in the rear seat that gave me another 11 gallons, or just under 2 hours of flying time. That extra fuel first came in handy at Toad River Lodge, which is a cool grass strip between Fort Nelson and Watson Lake, as the PA-11 didn't quite have the range to make that leg safely nonstop. But soon I had taken back off again, headed towards Whitehorse. If you haven't seen my last video about ferrying to Alaska, then you can check it out in the description text below, but suffice to say that thankfully this time the fuel stop in Teslin, and then ultimately the landing at Whitehorse, was a lot less eventful than the first time through. In fact, this time the entire ferry was running absolutely flawlessly, and I spent that beautiful evening in Whitehorse watching this de Havilland beaver gently rock against its mooring at the seaplane base. I woke up early the next morning and took off as early as I could. As I climbed away from Whitehorse, the sun peeking over the mountains and the air that was dead calm created one of the most serene moments I've had flying. It was a great reminder of how lucky I was to be here, to have this job, and exactly why I love doing what I do. But I was brought back to reality by how cold it was at altitude, and the little heater in the PA-11 wasn't very adequate. Thankfully, it warmed up as the day went along, and I made great progress crossing back into the U.S. at Northway uneventfully. I tried to make it as far as I could that evening, but some bad weather was approaching along with the darkness. Thankfully, another pilot told me of the perfect place to stop for the night: Red Eagle Lodge right off the Glen Highway in Chistachina. I landed at the little grass strip and got a small, inexpensive cabin for the night. I waited out the weather listening to the lodge owners tell of stories from the time they flew their Cessna 182 all the way to Russia. That was pretty cool. Again, it was a remarkable evening. A perfect stop on a flawless ferry so far. But in the back of my mind that night, I knew the next day was going to be a challenge. What I didn't realize, though, is that it would be the most stressful flight of my career. But before I can move on with the story, I have to provide some context so that you can understand all that was going on, as there was a number of different things that combined to make that flight so stressful. In contrast to every other Alaska ferry I've done to Anchorage, the PA-11 needed delivered to Cordova, which is located on the south-central coast on the east side of the Prince William Sound. Cordova is walled off by tall mountains to the north and blockaded by the Gulf of Alaska to the south. This means that there are only a few routes a small airplane can take to get to Cordova, either coming all the way up the coast from the southeast, coming across the sound from the west via Anchorage, or approaching from the north via one of two breaks in the mountains, one of which near Valdez called Thompson Pass, and the other where the Copper River breaks through the mountains to get to the Gulf. Because I was coming from the east and neither me nor the PA-11 were equipped for long overwater flights, this practically eliminated the western route from Anchorage. I considered following the coastal route from the east, but ultimately decided against it, partly because of the many open water stretches required, but mainly because of the unreliable weather. Since 10 to 20,000 foot mountains line the coast blocking escape once you start the coastal route, bad weather can block you in for days. So I ultimately took the highway route. The highway route had much better weather as it normally does, but this meant that I had to approach Cordova from one of the two passes to the north. From the north, the first option was flying down the highway through Thompson Pass towards Valdez, and then island or peninsula hopping over to Cordova. The second option was to follow the Copper River from Gulkana all the way to the delta where it dumped into the Gulf, and then follow the coast west to Cordova. Now that I had to choose one of two options, I looked at the weather on the day of the flight. On the day of the flight, the coastal weather was about as normal as coastal Alaska weather could be, seemingly unpredictable. As I watched the TAFs and METARs, it seemed that every time the forecast called for VFR and good weather, the METAR for that time would have a layer of low scud rolling through. And every time the TAF predicted low IFR, there was nothing but a high VFR ceiling of about 6,000 or so. The one thing that I saw consistently, however, was that though Valdez had seemingly better ceilings than Cordova, the visibility was predicted to be much worse with more rain. Whereas Cordova had 10 miles visibility all day with only the occasional 700-foot layer rolling through. The weather at Valdez was definitely not inviting, so I looked at the route down the Copper River. Unfortunately, the only available weather information for the Copper River route were two weather cameras, one at each end of the route. Though I knew the weather cameras left about 80 nautical miles of mountains and river unaccounted for, the weather looked decent at both ends, and I leaned toward the Copper River route. I still had time to make a final decision at my last fuel stop in Gulkana, so I stored the iPad and took off from Red Eagle Lodge weighing the options. As I winged my way over to Gulkana, still weighing my options, I remembered something I watched play out on the news the last time I was in Alaska.
New this morning, an overdue aircraft that went missing from Valdez Monday has been found.
According to Alaska State Troopers, the pilot and sole occupant of the plane, 38-year-old Andy Anderson of Sutton, was found dead among the wreckage. Around 2:15 p.m. yesterday, an Alaska Army National Guard Black Hawk helicopter crew located the red and white Aeronca Champion aircraft at the top of Thompson Pass, about 1,000 feet off the Richardson Highway.
Anderson's body was recovered and is being taken to the state medical examiner's office. The NTSB is investigating the cause of the crash.
With that fresh in my mind and the weather not showing any improvement over Valdez, I decided that the Copper River was a better option. Though the highway had a nearly 4,000-foot mountain pass to navigate, there would be no mountains in the river. Unfortunately, there were also no airports or small airstrips on that 80 nautical mile stretch of river either. In fact, there were no towns, no houses, and not even any roads to speak of. And because of this, I knew that if I ran into any trouble, I'd have to find a sandbar to put the plane down on and try to figure it out. Though I had the supplies to camp out for several days and the PA-11 was well equipped to land on many of the sandbars that lined the Copper River, it wasn't exactly something I wanted to do if I could avoid it. So I designated an S1, or decision point, if you will, based on fuel range, where a turnaround after that point would most likely require a landing on a sandbar to refuel to make it back to Chitna. I figured if I ran into a wall of weather before that point, it would be an easy decision to turn around back to Chitna. But if I hit weather after that point, I'd have to make the decision to either turn back to Chitna and find a sandbar to refuel on, land on a sandbar nearby and wait out the weather, or find a hole in the weather and continue on to Cordova without landing. I will say that landing on a sandbar would have been a much more enticing option if I had huge tundra tires or was more familiar with the actual surface of the sandbars in the Copper River. I mean, which sandbars are super soft, which ones are hard enough to land on no problem, I didn't really know for sure, but just like any other normal airplane flying over corn and wheat fields in the lower 48, I knew I could use one in an emergency, but the thought of testing it out was not enticing. In any case, I identified my, albeit few, outs of turning around or landing on a sandbar, and I took off for Cordova. The weather was great, with only an overcast layer high above, and the PA-11 was running awesome, just as it had the entire trip. After landing in Chitna, I topped off the tanks from my fuel cans and set off again quickly. I didn't want to miss a weather window, though I couldn't check for any weather updates anyway, as the cell service and ADS-B coverage had already dropped off by then. However, immediately after takeoff, my heart sank, as it looked like there was a full wall of weather up ahead, where the river turned into a narrow canyon. Since I had just taken off, I figured I had plenty of time to investigate, and I'm glad I did, because what looked like a wall of clouds from afar turned out to be just a small layer of fog clinging to the side of the mountain. Once I got up close, I was able to see that the river was clear of clouds, and it only looked like a wall because of the curve of the river following the mountains. Also, as I got close, I realized that the steep canyon walls meant that in the small chance my engine failed, it would make absolutely zero difference whether I was flying at an altitude of 1,000 feet or 5 feet. So I chose the more fun of the two and flew through the narrow canyon just a couple feet off the water. And boy, was it a thrill. It was one of those moments where you feel completely alive. But soon the canyon ended and I popped out on the other side to what seemed like a whole different world. The river I broke out to was lined with mountains crowding either side. Waterfalls poured down the sides periodically, seemingly just appearing out of nowhere out of the clouds that obscured the tops of the mountains. But the river was relatively clear of clouds, so I continued on, admiring the scenery as I went. Unfortunately, I was trying to save my batteries just in case of an emergency, so I didn't catch much of the flight down the Copper River. But in the few shots I did get, you can see that the clouds clung to the side of the mountains, and though from afar they look like a wall because of the bend of the river, once I got close to them, time and time again, the river proved to be clear of clouds and I'd continue on to the next curve. Though the remoteness and unknown terrain was a bit nerve-wracking, the weather was proving to be decent, if not absolutely beautiful in its own right. I may have even started to relax a little, subconsciously thinking it was going to continue to be perfect all the way to Cordova. I could not have been more wrong. Almost immediately after I passed my designated decision point, I came to a sharp curve where the river narrowed. It looked just like every other curve in the river before, with clouds following the side of the mountain, and I had no reason to believe that this curve would be any different. But as I rounded that curve in the river, I quickly found that the clouds extended a couple hundred feet over the river, and it started raining hard enough to obscure visibility. In fact, the rain and clouds completely obscured the opposite bank of the river. In just a few short moments, one of the most beautiful and serene flights I've ever had suddenly turned into the most stressful flight of my career. I wish I had the wherewithal to turn on my camera and capture the moment, but hopefully you can understand that I was a bit distracted. But anyways, though the left riverbank was completely obscured, thankfully I could still see through the rain at least a mile or two up ahead towards the right bank. I started weighing my options. Because of the obscured left bank, I realized I didn't have enough space to turn around in the width of the river. Therefore, a turnaround would have meant turning over unfamiliar terrain and then possibly losing my way and running into a mountain. Another option would have been to try to find a sandbar to land on and wait out the weather, but as we've previously discussed before, this wasn't a great option and I didn't know how long the weather would last. What I did know was that there was a well-defined tree line covering the right bank of the river that I could see very clearly. Seeing as the tree-lined bank was well-defined and there was light up ahead indicating that the weather wasn't getting any worse, I felt like my best option was to hug the tree line and continue, using the riverbank as a guide to ensure that I was going the correct direction. But it was definitely one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make. So, there I was, at the most stressful part of the most stressful flight of my career, zipping along at treetop level, clinging to a tree-lined bank with the other bank completely obscured from fog and rain, desperately looking for a sandbar to potentially land on should I lose the last sliver of visibility I had upriver that indicated better weather. The clouds and rain only lasted a few miles, maybe 5 at the most, but that's about 5 minutes in the PA-11, and I can assure you from experience that 5 minutes being on the edge of your seat, clinging to a riverbank as your source of navigation feels like a lifetime. It wasn't until I finally caught a glimpse of the $1 Million Bridge and the clear horizon up ahead that I reached up and quickly hit the record button. Zooming in on the scene behind me, I can hopefully give you a sense of what the weather was like, but I can assure you it improved substantially by the time the camera started rolling. You can see that the opposite bank of the river is still completely obscured, but up ahead, I could see the Childs Glacier glowing in the distance. As I got closer, it was obvious I had made it through the worst of the rain, and I could see the ceiling opening up well ahead. The sense of relief was immense, and it spilled out into a huge sigh. It was absolutely the most stressed I had ever been in an airplane, but somehow I had made it out. And not only that, I was then suddenly plunged into some of the most beautiful scenery I'd ever flown in. I was so elated that I couldn't help but just drop in over the glacier trying to get a closer look, and it was amazing. You can even see the dramatic change of emotion on my face after dropping in over the glacier. I continued on to Cordova and the weather continued to improve. The approach through the mountains, down the valley, over the town, and then the angled final over the water to the little dirt runway, and stopping in under 400 feet total distance was one that will rank high on my list of favorite landings ever. I'm tempted to make a whole separate video on just the approach and landing into Cordova because the video doesn't do it justice. It is just absolutely beautiful and such a cool place to fly into. But after I landed, I pulled over into the parking area across the road and shut down. My most stressful flight was over. You could argue that flying low over the rapids and Wood Canyon, continuing on even though the weather was marginal, or dropping in over the glacier was too risky for you, or that you would have made different decisions. And that's fair enough. But at the time, I just did what I always do, which is the best I can with the information available. And I can say that I absolutely do not regret it because the best parts of the entire trip was flying low through Wood Canyon, pushing through marginal weather in some of the most remote terrain in the US, and dropping in over a magnificent glacier. And though I'll look back on that flight knowing it was the most stressful flight I've ever had, I'll also look back on that flight and know it was the best flight I've ever had. But anyways, that's the story of my most stressful flight. I want to say that I'm close to 10,000 subscribers now, and I want to thank each and every one of you for your support. The only reason I make these videos is because I enjoy it, and I'm glad to see that there are some other people out there that enjoy them as well. But if I do manage to reach 10,000, I'm thinking of making a few things of merchandise available just to help offset the cost of the time it takes to make one of these videos, since I have 0 sponsors and each video takes roughly about 40 hours of work to make. If you're interested in that or have any ideas of what kind of merch you'd like to see, leave some notes in the comments. But for now, I thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you.